Elias Boone was a man who craved silence. In the spring of 1910, he built a cabin deep in the Appalachian Mountains of eastern Tennessee, where the hills rolled thick with oak and hickory, and the air carried the scent of damp earth and pine. He was 42, his hands rough from years working the coal mines in West Virginia until a cave-in broke his arm and left him with a limp. The mines had paid well, but the clamor of men and machines wore him down. He wanted no part of towns or their chatter. So, with his savings, he bought a small plot of land in a valley where the nearest neighbor was 10 miles away. And there he built his home, a sturdy cabin of logs and clay, with a stone chimney and a slanted roof to shed the rain. Elias lived simply. His days began with the dawn, when the mist hung low over the hills and the first bird stirred. He chopped wood, tended a small garden of potatoes and beans, and checked the traps he set for rabbits and squirrels. A few chickens scratched in a pen by the cabin, and a root cellar kept his stores safe from the damp. The forest was his company, its sounds, winding through the leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, the trickle of a nearby creek, his only conversation. He liked it that way. It was honest work, a life unburdened by the noise of others. One crisp morning in late September, Elias set out to check his traps along the creek that ran a quarter mile from his cabin. The air was sharp, the ground soft from recent rain. As he knelt by a trap, he froze. In the mud, not 10 feet from the water, were footprints unlike any he'd seen. They weren't bear, nor deer, nor man. The prints were wide, almost human, but the toes splayed out in an unnatural way, too broad for a person, too small for a bear. Each was about 7 inches long, pressed deep into the earth, as if whatever made them carried weight. Elias traced the edge of one with his finger. The shape puzzled him, too deliberate for an animal, too strange for a human. He scanned the trees, but nothing stirred. The trail led to the creek and vanished where the water lapped against the bank. He stood, his breath visible in the cool air, and listened. The forest was quiet, save for the soft rush of the stream. Elias had tracked game his whole life, but these prints unsettled him. They didn't belong. He told himself it was some odd creature, maybe a lost animal from deeper in the mountains. But as he walked back to his cabin, the image of those tracks lingered, sharp and clear, like a question he couldn't answer. That night, Elias sat by his fire, a worn copy of Moby Dick open on his lap. The wind whistled through a crack in the cabin wall, making the lantern flicker. Then he heard it. A sound that cut through the quiet. Not a howl or a scream, but a soft, mournful whimper, like a child crying alone in the dark. It came from the woods beyond his clearing, faint but steady, carrying a weight of loneliness that made his chest tighten. Elias set the book down and stepped onto the porch, holding his lantern high. "Anyone out there?" he called, his voice swallowed by the night. The crying stopped, then started again, softer now, as if whatever made it was moving away. He waited, his breath shallow, but saw nothing in the shadows. Uneasy, he returned inside and barred the door. Sleep didn't come easy that night. The next morning, Elias found no new tracks, but the crying returned at dusk, the same sad, plaintive sound. For 3 nights, it came and went, always just beyond the trees. On the 4th night, Elias made a decision. He took a tin plate, filled it with scraps, a heel of cornbread, a strip of dried venison, and set it on a flat rock near the edge of his clearing. He didn't know why, only that the sound stirred something in him, a need to help. By morning, the plate was empty, the food gone without a trace. No crumbs, no scraps scattered, just gone. That night, the crying came again, softer, as if grateful. Elias smiled to himself. Whatever was out there was hungry, and he wasn't one to let a creature suffer. The days grew shorter, the air colder, as October settled over the mountains. Elias kept his routine, chopping wood, tending his garden, checking traps, but his thoughts were on the crying creature. Each night, he left food on the rock, a boiled potato, a handful of berries, a piece of smoked fish. Each morning, the food was gone, taken cleanly into the forest. The crying continued, softer now, less desperate, but it never stopped. Elias began to wonder what he was feeding. A lost child? A wounded animal? The strange footprints stayed in his mind, their shape too human, too not. One morning, just before dawn, Elias was splitting logs near the cabin. The fog was thick, wrapping the trees in a gray veil. As he swung his axe, he felt a prickle on the back of his neck, the sense of being watched. He lowered the axe and turned slowly. There, at the edge of the clearing, crouched a small figure, no taller than 4 feet. It was covered in dark, matted fur, its arms long and thin, its frame frail. Its eyes, large and dark, caught the faint light, watching him with a mix of fear and curiosity. It wasn't a bear, nor a man, nor anything Elias could name. It didn't run, just stayed there, trembling slightly in the cold. Elias held still, his heart pounding. He didn't want to scare it. Slowly, he set the axe down and walked to the rock where he left the food. He placed a fresh piece of rabbit meat on it, then stepped back, giving the creature space. It watched him, unmoving, then crept forward, its movements cautious but deliberate. It snatched the meat and vanished into the fog, silent as a shadow. Elias stood there, his breath caught in his throat. He'd seen it. Not a dream, not a trick of the light. Something real, something alive. After that morning, Elias felt a shift in himself. The creature wasn't just a mystery. It was a living thing, young and vulnerable, needing help. He began leaving more food, apples from a wild tree, roasted chestnuts, a slice of bread. Each morning, the offerings were gone. He found new footprints near the rock, the same strange, splayed toes, but no other signs. He didn't tell anyone. There was no one to tell, but he felt a quiet purpose growing in him. Whatever this creature was, it trusted him enough to take his food. That was enough for now. One afternoon, Elias followed the creek upstream, curious to see if the creature left more tracks. The forest was dense, the ground carpeted with leaves. Near a bend in the creek, he found fresh prints, leading away from the water into a thicket of laurel. He moved carefully, his boots silent on the damp earth. The trail ended in a small clearing, where sunlight broke through the canopy. There, sitting on a fallen log, was the creature. Its fur was patchy, its ribs visible beneath. It looked up, its eyes meeting his, not startled, but wary. Elias knelt at a distance and spoke softly. "I ain't gonna hurt you." He reached into his satchel and pulled out a handful of dried apples. The creature tilted its head, then edged closer, taking the fruit gently from his hand. Its fingers were long, almost human, but covered in coarse fur. For the next week, Elias visited the clearing daily, bringing food and water. The creature grew less skittish, lingering longer each time. It never spoke, but its eyes held a quiet intelligence, watching Elias as he watched it. He began to think of it as a young Bigfoot, a name he'd heard in miners' tales, though he'd never believed them until now. It was thin, but stronger each day, its movements less shaky. Elias felt a warmth he hadn't known since leaving the mines, a sense of connection to something beyond himself. One evening, as he sat by his fire, he heard a rustle outside. The creature stood just beyond the porch, closer than ever, its silhouette caught in the firelight. Elias smiled and said, "You're welcome here." The creature didn't move, but its eyes softened, as if it understood. Winter crept closer, the nights growing sharp and long. Elias worked harder to prepare, stacking firewood high and harvesting the last of his garden. The young Bigfoot, as he now called it in his mind, stayed near the cabin, appearing at dusk to take the food he left. Sometimes it sat at the edge of the clearing, watching him work, its dark eyes tracking his movements. Elias talked to it, not expecting answers, but finding comfort in the sound of his own voice. He told it about the mines, the weight of coal dust in his lungs, the quiet he'd found in these hills. The creature listened, or seemed to, its head tilted slightly, its breathing slow and steady. One frosty morning, Elias found the creature huddled near the rock, its fur damp and matted from the night's rain. It shivered, its thin frame trembling in the cold. Elias acted without thinking. He gathered an armful of dry leaves and pine boughs, building a small shelter near the cabin's chimney, where the stones radiated warmth. He coaxed the creature closer, draping an old wool blanket over its shoulders. It hesitated, then settled into the makeshift bed, its eyes half closed. Elias sat nearby, feeding the fire, watching the creature's shivering ease. That day, he knew it needed more than food. It needed care, a place to feel safe. The young Bigfoot began spending more time near the cabin. It would curl up in the shelter at night, warmed by the chimney, and take food directly from Elias's hand during the day. Its fur grew thicker, its movements stronger. Elias noticed small things, how it mimicked him, stacking twigs in neat piles, how it sniffed the air before approaching, how its eyes seemed to hold a story he couldn't read. One evening, as he repaired a trap, he heard a low growl from the woods. His heart quickened. The mountains held bears, wildcats, and worse. He looked up to see two glowing eyes in the dark, a large shape moving through the trees. The young Bigfoot leapt to its feet, standing between Elias and the threat, its own growl louder, fiercer. The eyes retreated, the shape fading into the forest. Elias exhaled, his hands shaking. The creature had protected him, just as he'd protected it. From that moment, their bond deepened. Elias no longer felt alone. The creature wasn't just a guest, it was a companion, a silent partner in this wild place. He taught it small things, how to crack walnuts, how to drink from the creek without muddying the water. In return, it showed him paths through the forest he'd never noticed, hidden trails where the moss grew soft and thick. They moved through the days together, two souls bound by necessity and trust. Elias knew the winter would test them both. Snow was coming, and the young Bigfoot, though stronger, was still young, still fragile. He vowed to keep it safe, no matter what. Snow fell heavy that December, blanketing the valley in white. The creek froze at its edges, and the wind howled through the hills. Elias worked tirelessly, chopping extra wood and reinforcing the cabin against the cold. The young Bigfoot stayed close, sleeping in the shelter by the chimney, its breath visible in the frigid air. Elias brought it warm broth, scraps of cornbread soaked in grease, anything to keep its strength up. The creature ate eagerly, its eyes bright with gratitude. At night, Elias kept the fire roaring, the cabin a warm haven against the storm. One bitter evening, as snow piled against the door, Elias found the creature shivering outside, too weak to move. Its fur was crusted with ice, its body curled tight. Without hesitation, he carried it inside, setting it near the hearth. He wrapped it in blankets, rubbing its thin arms to warm them. The creature's eyes fluttered, tired but alive. Elias stayed awake all night, feeding the fire, whispering soft words of comfort. "You're gonna make it," he said, more to himself than to the creature. By morning, it stirred, its breathing stronger, and took a sip of warm water from a tin cup. The winter tested them both. Elias rationed his food carefully, sharing what he had with the creature. He noticed it growing playful despite the cold, tossing snow with its long fingers, chasing shadows across the clearing. Elias laughed for the first time in years, the sound startling him. The young Bigfoot seemed to understand, mimicking his smile with a tilt of its head. They spent their days in quiet companionship, Elias telling stories of his old life, the creature listening with its steady, knowing gaze. He began to think of it as family, the only family he'd ever need. One night, as the snow eased, Elias heard a new sound, a deep, resonant call from the forest. Not a cry, but a summons. The young Bigfoot sat up, its ears pricked. Elias felt a pang of unease. The call came again, closer, and the creature stepped outside, staring into the dark. Elias followed, his lantern casting long shadows. In the distance, he saw a shape, taller, broader than the young one, its eyes glinting in the light. The young Bigfoot moved toward it, then paused, looking back at Elias. He nodded, his throat tight. "Go on," he whispered. The creature hesitated, then bounded into the trees, following the larger figure. Elias stood alone, the snow falling softly around him. Spring came slowly, the snow melting into streams that fed the creek. The forest bloomed with dogwood and redbud, the air alive with birdsong. Elias returned to his routine, but the cabin felt emptier without the young Bigfoot. He missed its quiet presence, the way it watched him work, the bond they'd built through months of care. He didn't regret letting it go. He knew it belonged in the wild, but the silence was heavier now, the loneliness sharper. One morning, Elias walked to the clearing where he'd first seen the creature. He sat on the fallen log, a handful of berries in his pocket, half hoping it might return. The forest was quiet, but alive, its pulse steady under the new green. As he stood to leave, he heard a rustle. Turning, he saw a tall figure at the edge of the trees, a large Bigfoot, its fur dark and thick, its eyes calm and steady. Beside it stood the young one, taller now, its fur sleek and healthy. They watched him, not with fear, but with recognition. The young Bigfoot stepped forward, placing a small pile of acorns on the log. A gift, Elias realized, like the food he'd once offered. The adult Bigfoot met Elias's gaze, and for a moment, he felt understood, as if it knew what he'd done for its kin. Then, silently, it turned, the young one following. They paused at the tree line, looking back one last time. Elias raised a hand, a quiet farewell. The creatures slipped into the forest, gone as quickly as they'd come. Elias stood there, the acorns in his hand, a smile tugging at his lips. He'd given the young Bigfoot a chance, and it had found its way home. Elias returned to his cabin, the forest alive around him. He never saw the creatures again, but he didn't need to. Their footprints, fresh ones, larger now, appeared sometimes near the creek, a sign they were still out there, living free. On quiet nights, when the wind carried a faint, familiar cry, Elias felt a warmth in his chest. He'd been part of something bigger, a story of kindness that crossed the divide between man and mystery. He kept their secret, sharing it only in his journal, hoping it might one day remind others that even in the wildest places, compassion could build a bridge. Elias lived out his days in the hills, content in his solitude, knowing he'd made a difference in a world that asked for nothing, but gave everything in return.